who are Christian, and I don't care if you're Christian or if you, what your religion is, it's your own personal business, have left comments on my feed saying things like "return to Christ" or "come to Jesus" and all this stuff. And I was listening to Christian Morris on a show last night, and the the guy said something about he was a Christian or something, like some guy chap down in Cork or something, and Christian didn't push him on it, respectfully. But I could see where Christian was going with the whole thing, and it's interesting now, and it's something that if you're to be on my channel and to be part of this channel, you have to be aware of. Now, first of all, I I have no problem with anyone's faith or religion, and you're perfectly entitled to find your spiritual path or not, as you praise. That's up to you. That's your business. But I just want to. This is specifically mentioned at Christians now, and it probably also could be done with like most religions, but in this specific case, Christians. Now, I'm not putting you down because you're a Christian. That's your own business again, and I'm certainly not trying to convert you to another way of thinking. But Christian people are generally attracted to the general ethos of the synoptic gospels, and that being the life of Christ and the stories contained within the four books of the New Testament, the four main books of the New Testament, that were basically solidified starting around 160 AD by people who didn't actually know Jesus and by people who were Jews. And Christianity was, up until about the reign of Sylvester I, about 900, or maybe later, Sylvester II, about 1000 AD, was a Jewish religion. It was not. It was not. It was. It was a branch of. It was seen as a branch of Judaism, and only really became the Christianity we know today after Sylvester II, about 1000 AD, and that's when you're seeing things, unique Christian concepts like hell coming to the fore and so on, that didn't exist within Judaism. There was a thing within Judaism called Shoel, which was a kind of a place of lost souls, but it wasn't the hell that we hear about with hellfire and brimstone and all that kind of thing. That was a much later addition that was brought in as a kind of an insurance policy by the Vatican. And I do agree it's very important to distinguish between the Vatican and Christianity, and that's very important. And things like later on came on, that Lucifer became a misquote in the King James Bible. There was no mention of Lucifer at all in any of the old scriptures. That was a mistaken translation in the King James Bible. Lucifer was actually a Roman god, a Greek god before that, called Phosphor, the brother of Diana and the son of Aurora. These are pagan goddesses and pagan god, and had nothing to do with fallen angels. That was a thing that came along later, and that's a whole other discussion I've covered many times. But I should do a new video on that because there's so many new people on my channel. But anyway, in terms of, that's the reason why the general ethos of love thy enemy, the things all sound very pleasant, live a good life. And this is not unique, of course, to Christianity, but it was solidified beautifully within the Synoptic Gospels and how it's portrayed in Catechism and stuff like that. And so, but that's not the reason why you're a Christian, unless you were not a Christian at one time and then converted. The reason why you're a Christian is the same reason someone in India is Hindu, and the same reason someone in Saudi Arabia is a Muslim, and the same reason someone in Japan is a Buddhist, and someone in China is a Taoist. It's because your parents were, and most likely, or your grandparents going back. You inherited a spiritual tradition that was handed down from generation to generation. And therefore you hear people say things like, the West was built on Judeo-Christian values. Actually, it wasn't. It wasn't at all. The West was built on classical paganism, predominantly, with some other influences. but predominantly classical paganism. And this is what Greek and Rome, you hear even modern contemporary scholars talk about the likes of Plato and Aristotle and, you know, Marcus Aurelius, as these people are almost honorary Christians. No, these are pagans, just like Hypatia was a pagan. Now, so that's what Western society is built on: paganism, classical paganism. And if you look at the Renaissance, that was the renaissance of paganism. They were trying to get back to a decent way of living in Europe after the horrors of of Christianity in the post Dark Age period. Things like the horrors of, there was also terrible social problems and things like plagues and stuff like that ravaged Europe. But it was an attempt to get back to how good the ancient world was, the classical pagan world was. And also the Enlightenment. You have people saying, well, in America, the Enlightenment was a Judeo-Christian thing. And it was not. The founding fathers of the United States, most of them hated Christianity and were very open about it. In fact, so much so that some even consider that Islam would be a more appropriate religion for Americans, believe it or not. Look it up, than Christianity. And this is why, and they again look towards the classical pagan world. This is why all the federal buildings and all the designs and everything, and even the names of their slaves, were all based on classical pagan Rome, all the neoclassical architecture and so on. So, although Christianity had been the dominant force for about 1,500 years, give or take, and there was periods where it collapsed almost completely, particularly around the time of the Vikings, and it it became very powerful because the message appealed to people, to the point where eventually, and then and because Christianity is evangelical, just like Islam, it converts. Although it's not as brutal in its conversions as Islam. And then people generally, they became institutionalized and cultified through this solidified thing through the centuries. And then people think, well, you have people in Ireland whose ancestors go right back to this island, right back to the ancient times, and they'll talk about things like the great epics like Finn McCool and Cuchulainn and Queen Maeve. And yet the one thing they never think about is that none of them were Christian. If they existed, or that world they came from was pagan. And the interloper St. Patrick, see, this is what I find amazing, and particularly in Ireland. St. Patrick wasn't Irish. He was a Welsh Roman patrician, which is where Patrick comes from. And he was basically a Henry Kissinger character of his time. Now, I know people hearing this are going to go, what? If he existed, and it's probably he didn't, but he was probably also based on some element that came from Roman Britain into Ireland to do conversions, and they would have converted Ireland the same way India came under the British Raj, that there would have been local chieftains. In the case of India, you would have the Rajas, but in Ireland, local chieftains or kings who would have been approached by Roman diplomats, Christians at this point, offering them to come into the Roman system, and they would have offered them things like money or stuff like that, or maybe even an army would wipe them out. They said no. We just don't know the history. That's the great tragedy of Ireland's history, is that we know almost nothing around from the period of St. Patrick. It's not been recorded, which is always very suspicious, because that could possibly almost indicate atrocities took place. Now, so this St. Patrick entity would have been a Henry Kissinger type character, bringing Ireland into the Roman fold. That's what that would have been about. And the new religion would have been Christianity. So when Christians talk about, this new Luciferian religion coming out of the UN, of Theosophy or whatever, they have to understand that their religious ancestry and heritage came to Europe the same way. Basically, what they called missionaries were diplomats, and many of them carried large amounts of money with them, and they paid off people to convert. And they got deals and trade deals and all protection by armies, just like the way the EU has expanded from the initial 7 countries to like nearly every country in Europe at this point. That's how it was done. Now, does that diminish the fact that there's a spiritual element to the Jesus Christ story in Christianity? Of course not. Of course, absolutely there isn't. It still exists. The basic thing that you could pray to still exists. But when someone says, I'm a Christian, like an Irish person says, I've returned to Christ, well, that's your own business. Good luck to you. That's the path that you choose. Fair play to you. But you're not returning to an Irish religion. And this has always been my enormous contention with this country in terms of its destiny as a nation. As long as we're shackled to Christianity, we're always shackled to foreignness. And that's all the most horrific wars fought in Ireland, from the Confederacy Wars and all right up to the Troubles in the night, were all over Christianity. And people say, oh, they weren't about independent, they were about Christianity, because that was the divisional schism, that was the software, the divisional schism software that was used to make it happen. And that's how it is. Now, again, it's your business. But what makes you think, you being a Christian, just because you were raised in a Judeo-Christian society, and there's as much to call it a Judeo-Islamic society, because basically those three religions are the same anyway. But what makes you think that you are any more closer to the truth regarding the nature of God than a Hindu in India who was brought up as a Hindu through generations of Hinduism and thinks, well, that's my way? Although Hinduism is a bad example, because that's a very tolerant religion. If you go into a Hindu temple, many of them in India or in Sri Lanka or Indonesia, outside the Hindu temple, you will often see little shrines to the Virgin Mary, Jesus Christ, or Buddha, because they don't have a problem with Hindus saying, oh, I like Jesus and I like what Jesus did. And that's actually how Hinduism, Catholicism has penetrated so well into places like the Tamil regions of Sri Lanka, because they were open to the Jesus idea anyway. And this is the same thing. The only reason you think you're a Christian is because of your racial heritage, your nationality. But it wasn't always that case. Irish people have existed on this island as Irish people for about 6,000 years, as far as we can tell. That's 5,500 years more than we were Christians. And yet we dismiss the whole 5,500 years prior to the arrival of this Henry Kissinger-like character, whoever St. Patrick was, to these islands, and then dismiss all that and say this is what we are. And it's the same thing that's echoed all over you see what happened in England. You had the Celtic pagans, and then they were basically replaced by the Christian Anglo-Saxons. And then the Christian Anglo-Saxons were then, in much of England, particularly in the north, in the Danelands, were replaced by the pagan Norse. Very interesting. It's and then again, with the 1066 and the Battle of Hastings, you had the Catholicism come back in a different way in England, and then people were in England were Catholic until the Reformation in the 1500s, and then you had mostly Protestants in England and Scotland and a handful of Catholics. And again, this is, they'll say, well, Presbyterianism was an improved version of Catholicism. Well, it wasn't really. It was a return to Judaism. If you look at particularly Luther, this was the whole purpose of Lutheranism. If you look at those edicts that were nailed to the church by Martin Luther, they're really about things like the nature of, celebration of feast days and things like that. They're really not this radical thing to take down the church. But the Vatican was so edgy and itchy, particularly after, the trouble they'd had with Vikings and stuff like that. Even hundreds of years later, they still had that memory. And there was still paganism in parts of Eastern Europe, like in Karelia and Prussia and, parts of Finland. There was still vast pagan cultures and societies, not to mention the Lapps in northern Scandinavia. They were always terrified of paganism coming back in some form. And this is why they co-opted paganism. This is why they made their basilicas and their churches and their monuments and their statues and their saints look like pagans. This is why they modeled Jesus on Mithra and later on, for Germanic Christianity, on Thor, Woden, and so on. And the Virgin Mary is Hecate, and and then they aligned all the Christian feast days with pagan feast days. Otherwise, it wouldn't have taken off. And so to say, see, a lot of problem I have a lot of Christians is they think that they have the default religion, that theirs is the only one that ever can really work. But that's quite a prejudiced viewpoint. And when I think of the term God, I think it's in the term of the Hindu almost version of what God is, the unknown force of the universe, and it's powerful and it's behind everything. And that's enough. From that point on, that's enough. Everything else you apply to that in terms of archetypes could be used to demarcate and classify individual parts of these gods, and so on. And it's, if you look, now this is the thing, the reason why Presbyterian Christianity is obsessed with proselytizing, converting people, is because there's no magic in it. And it functions in that form. Now, Catholicism has magic in it because the transubstantiation. I'm not putting down Protestants. Don't think I'm anything like that. There's a lot to be said for that, and things like the Enlightenment and so on. But the transubstantiation of the Catholic Church is a magical act, the transformation of, bread and water into the blood and flesh of Jesus Christ. And that's a very powerful thing, especially in the old days of the Latin Mass. That's one of the reasons there's a kind of a rebellion in the Vatican now, because some of the older priests have realized that since the casting off of the Latin Mass with Vatican II, the Second Vatican Council, I think it was in 1968 or 69, that Catholicism lost its way and became secular. And this is why you have a point now where the current pope is this close to legalizing abortion. That's literally what it's like at the moment in the Catholic Church, and there's a huge rebellion against it. And I don't blame Orthodox Catholics at all for feeling that way. I'd be amazed too that, like, if I walked into churches in Rome and saw pagan idols on the church, overtly pagan, not Christianized version like Pachamama, I'd be upset too. So this character, Saint Francis, is a very strange, and again, he's involved in this whole reset, but on a religious way. Now, and that's what when you have no magic within the religion, you have a need to convert, because people are not converted naturally. Where, if you were to look at paganism, one of the things that defines paganism, all paganism, Indo-European pagan, classical paganism, Celtic paganism, Norse paganism, all of it, what defines it is magic. Big time. And the belief that you or your community can actually change reality around you through actual processes and rituals. And it's true. I mean, if we were pagans now, there'd be a pantheon of many gods. Now we would have a much better chance of standing up to what's going on in the world right now with this whole, like, this reset kind of thing, because it would give us an edge in terms of how our minds functioned. Because one of the things, and I'm not saying this now to hurt Christians, but the first New World Order was Christianity. It was the first one. It was the one world religion. I hear Christians talk about they're going to try to start a one world religion. No, the one world religion was Christianity. It really was. And particularly the Presbyterian element of that was seen finally as the solidifying force of empires and things like that. And it's no coincidence that the empires that flourished after the Reformation were predominantly Protestants, while the ones that didn't flourish as well were predominantly Catholic. Because the Presbyterian one, it kind of, like, I'll give you an example. We're coming up to the gunpowder plot, Guy Fawkes in England, that's around now, the celebration of it. Now, Guy Fawkes, for some reason in recent years, has been transformed into a kind of an enlightened character who was destroying politicians because they were corrupt. No, Guy Fawkes was the Manchester arena bomber of his day. He was a Jesuit fanatic. He was an absolute fanatic. And he wanted to kill the King of England, James, with a load of gunpowder, along with these conspirators of the gunpowder plot, because they wanted to restore Catholicism as the state religion of England and overthrow Presbyterianism. It had nothing to do with taking on a corrupt parliament. It was to do with destroying the what they saw as the heathen religion. Now, when they were caught and tried, and remember, Guy Fawkes, even though he was a Yorkshire man, he fought on behalf of Spain as a Catholic against Holland in the Spanish Netherlands wars, religious wars, and because he was so fanatically Catholic. And when they were executed, it's just like, you cannot believe, when Christians will often say things like, oh, well, one of the reasons the Roman Empire pagans failed is because of the horrors that went on in the Colosseum and this kind of thing. Well, the gunpowder plot conspirators, and you can look this up, they were sentenced to death to be hung, drawn, and quartered. But before they were hanged, they had their testicles, their genitalia chopped off and presented to them, and then fried in a pan in front of them. Yes, they were forced to watch their genitalias, castrated and watch their genitalia fried in a pan in front of them. Then they had their bowels removed and their guts taken out and burnt on a fire in front of them. And the next thing they would do is they would have them tied to 4 horses and then pulled apart by the horses. And the idea was that their death, their relief from the agony by being pulled apart, and often they survived when they were pulled apart for a little while longer, was to give them a death that was unfitting for either heaven or hell. Now, this was just deliberately done to show the masses that this was what will happen if you go against Christianity, in their case, Presbyterianism. And this is why your ancestors became terrified of hell and Christianity, by witnessing things like that. And they were told, and seeing paintings like Bosch's The Garden of Earthly Delights, and saying that's what hell looks like, and you'll burn for all eternity, being tortured just like Guy Fawkes was. And Guy Fawkes actually got out lucky, because he'd been so badly beaten up during the torture and interrogation in the Star Chamber, which is interesting because the Star Chamber in the Tower of London is not named because after he was a star. It's named after a Jewish type of tax or something like that on the state. It's fucking fascinating stuff. Anyway, he was so badly beaten up in the torturing process that when he was brought up to be hung, he fell and broke his neck, or he committed suicide and broke his neck. But this is more barbaric than anything you'd see in the Roman in the gladiatorial arena. And also, this is what these people were seeing. And this is what, like 500 years ago, not even that long ago, less, I think, probably 400 and something. And then the Presbyterian Enlightenment came along and stopped a lot of that nonsense, and Christianity became more secular among the Protestants, and kind of the same among the Catholics, and to the point now where when someone says they're a Christian, they generally say, I just pray to God and Jesus, and that's that. Fine, I've no problem with that. I've no problem with that. I think that's actually, it's prayers. There's nothing help, but it's true that, like, Christians don't really know the Bible at all, and last week I saw a thing about a Christian mass, and something about a priest in Carrickmacross in I think it's County Monaghan, and he was saying something about the lockdown destroying people, and he starts by talking about the first 5 books of the Torah. Now, what does the first 5 books in the children of Israel and the departure of the children of Israel to the holy land, what to do with Ireland? This is the thing I have with the whole thing, with the people saying, oh, I'm a Christian. What you're really saying is you're a Jew. Now, I know I'm not a Jew, I'm a Christian. Nah, you're a Jew. And that's what Christianity is. It's Second Temple Rabbinical Judaism. Jesus Christ, there's not one single document that says that Jesus Christ came to make a new religion. He was a reforming rabbi, whoever Jesus Christ was, if he even existed, or whatever amalgamation of rabbis in Judea, around the time of the Roman occupation he represents. But he was a rabbi, and that's why early Christianity, for the first better part of 1,000 years was Jewish. The symbol of the cross almost doesn't exist until, well, really, really later on. It doesn't become commonplace into the Middle Ages. The symbol of Christianity was a fish type symbol. And although scholars will point to something that looks like an X in a Christian catacomb in Rome from like 1900 years ago, it's actually an anchor belonging to a Jewish trader, a Jewish shipping merchant. And there's a lot of that kind of stuff goes on. Now, the symbol was the fish, and there's a theory that the fish is because of the age of Pisces. I don't know if that's true or not. The fish and it seems to be an arrangement of Greek words spelling out Jesus in Greek, Christos in Greek, in a kind of stylized logo. And they also say things like, well, they didn't use the cross symbol because they didn't use the cross symbol because they were hidden. No, Jewish Christians were very integrated into Roman society after Nero. When Nero was deposed, the Christians slowly became very, very powerful within Rome. They were the Scientology of their day. In fact, all the wealthy Romans who had previously been involved in the Dismanibus cult migrated into Christianity. It was the hip new religion from the East. It was like in the 60s where they all became Hindus, or hippies became Hindus, and Scientologists in the 80s. That's what Christianity was among the Roman establishment, the hip new religion. And the symbol of the fish they didn't hide it because they weren't persecuted. They moved into control positions within the Roman Empire very, very quickly. And not with Constantine. Constantine died a pagan. And even that symbol of the Pyro symbol, the Milvian Bridge, that symbol is an ancient symbol that's been found in caves like 5,000 years ago. And he just said he saw a mark in the sky. He didn't give any details. These are all later stories. And his Constantine the Great's arch, the Roman emperor apparently converted the world to Christianity. Well, on the arch that he had him commissioned for him after he died, he's doing a pagan sacrifice to the god Jupiter. So he died a pagan. And he just basically allowed Christianity to take over the Roman military because he thought that it would be a good religion for the army, because they wouldn't be afraid of dying if they thought they were going to go to heaven fighting in an early version of a crusade. So there's been all kinds of things all through history, and nearly all of them political, that have spooled along to the point now where you're calling yourself a Christian. And that's the same with Muslims. There's been all kinds of machinations through history and things that have happened that have brought you to the point where you think you are what you are. That you are what you are. But it's that they're not connected to Jesus Christ. That's the whole thing. They're not connected to that. They're connected to governments and politicians and political wars and political ideologies and laws and statutes and legalese and everything else, education systems that brought you to this point. You can only be a Christian if you say, one day I'm returning back. Well, not I'm returning back, but I'm becoming a Christian. And it really appeals to me. And that's pretty the only person that can really call themselves a Christian, because if you're a Christian just because your parents are one, you're not a Christian. You're just, if your father was, I don't know, into bondage, would you be into bondage for that sake? If he was into bicycles, would you be into, would you pick the religion as if it's almost like an innate aspect of your character? And so, like, the only Christians I think are really Christians are ones who were not Christians, or kind of fell away from it and then came back and said, no, this really appeals to me. And I get that. There's no problem with that. And I feel the same way. There's no reason why an Irish person couldn't be a Taoist or a Hindu, which I myself, I'm quite, connected to, mainly because it's very similar to paganism. It comes from the same Indo-European root. And this is the problem when you start thinking you're it because your parents were it, and you've then, that chap that was talking to Christian Morrison yesterday, I got the impression that he's never ever looked at, and many of the people in the alternative scene in Ireland, that they're all now, a lot of them are now Christians because they've never ever looked at anything else other than the religion they were raised with, assuming that though somehow that Finn McCool and Queen Maeve were all like, Catholics, and And I mean, there's even groups up in the north that actually, like sort of like Tara Lodge types, who actually would tell you that Finn McCool was not Finn McCool, Cuchulainn was a Protestant. I mean, this is how silly it gets. And well, but you get at academia, they talk about Plato and Aristotle and the rest of them as if they're Christians. They were not; they're all pagans. And and when people go on a spiritual journey, one of the great tragedies is they always seem to end up in some form of Christianity, even if it's something like a flying saucer cult or something. It's a flying saucer cult where Jesus is coming down on a spaceship. The way Scientology uses the big crucifix above their building in Clearwater, Florida. Uh, it always seems to be there's a Jesus element to it. And that's unfortunate because that then blocks out any kind of other spiritual exploration. Like I'm not going to have an Irish Christian stand at somewhere like Newgrange with me and then say Ireland is a Christian country when there's something there that's older than even Judaism, that's a spiritual building that our own people built. And then you're sitting there saying that it's an offshoot of Second Temple Rabbinical Judaism is the religion of Ireland, or if you're in England, the religion of England. And that's why I don't like it when you say to me, become a Christian. It's disrespectful. You'll never hear me say, become a Hindu, become a pagan. I'll never say that to you. It's none of my business to make you that way. And my soul is my own business. My destiny and my communication with the Creator is my business alone. It's nobody else's. And it's not for me to convert someone else. And it's also not for me to find offense. I'll give you an example. In Islam, right, in Islam, you literally cannot even say anything negative about it because the Quran is seen as the word of God. And we've seen those horrors that happened in Paris recently where a school teacher had his head cut off because he brought in cartoons of, he was decapitated by a pupil because he brought in cartoons of Muhammad to try and teach tolerance. At the same time, a movie like Midsummer is made, or even The Wicker Man, which are very bad, make pagans look very, very bad. Even like films like Season of the Witch, Halloween 3, make pagans look very bad. Do you see pagans marching in the streets demanding that movie studios should be burned down? That John Carpenter should be arrested, that Christopher Lee was our enemy, that, what's his name? Ari Aster, the director of Midsummer, should be, have a jihad of some a pagan jihad against him. No, we just say it's unfortunate. It's unfortunate that the stereotype lingers. The film he made before Midsummer, Hereditary, I think is a masterpiece, and it'll always be a masterpiece. I always see him as a great director. The film, Christopher Lee, love him. The Wicker Man, great film. There's loads to learn from that. But it's a great film and a fantastic soundtrack. That's the thing. We're very tolerant because we're secure in our beliefs. We're secure in them. Now, finally, and one more thing I want to say. A lot of you don't know what paganism is, and that's for another video. But I'll finish with this. Wicca and Wiccans are not pagans. Wicca is Jewish, and Wiccans are practicing Jews. And I'll give you, they're not pagans in any ways. It's a form of Judaism that seems to be aimed at women. It was created by Gerald Gardner, who was a British civil servant, who claimed that he had come across these folk rites that were enacted in the New Forest in England. And then when the English witchcraft laws ended, he wrote the first Wiccan Rede along with Aleister Crowley. Now this, Crowley's Thelema, if you know about it, as well as the Golden Dawn magic, is very rooted in Judaism. It's biblical. Again, nothing wrong with it. I'm just saying it is. Doreen Valentine, when she found she was she was an English I think she was English. When she found she was like she set herself up as a big in charge mama of of Wicca in England. When she found out, when she got people to admit that Aleister Crowley probably did write Wicca, come up with the rites of Wicca, she wrote the new Wicca the new Wicca Road, which is kind of like the new Bible of Wicca, it's even more Jewish again, right? And the story, and I'm not putting down Jews or anything. I'm nothing. I'm just pointing at, like, these are the things you have to be aware of when you start calling people names or things. Uh, and then finally, you have Miss Adler. Her father was a devotee and a colleague of Sigmund Freud. And she is considered the number one pagan in the world. She wrote the book Drawing Down the Moon. She's Jewish as well, and again, does her own business. But her father had schooled her in the ways of Sigmund Freud. So in many ways, she is to paganism what Edward Bernays is to mind control. And I still have people who call themselves, "Oh, I'm a pagan." Oh, really? What path do you follow? I'm a Wiccan. And then they're talking about Jewish angels like Raphael and Michael and Lilith and all this kind of stuff from the Bible, the Old Testament. You're not a pagan. If you want to be a Wiccan, and there's a lot of neat things in Wiccan. I think there's a lot of good things in Wiccan, particularly the whole thing of not doing any harm on others and stuff like that. I think, but unfortunately, most of them don't follow it. That's why they get a lot of them, these ratbags in Wicca, give it a bad name. But Margot Adler, yeah, she's Jewish, and Sigmund Freud, she's an Edward Bernays of paganism. That's what she is. That's how Jewish she is. There's how pagan she is, and that's our own business. I've no problem. I welcome anyone if you're anyone into paganism, but don't be changing it and saying it's paganism, because it's not. And finally, you have this. You have to learn to. Some of you have to learn to be tolerant of other people. You do. You have to, as other people's religions, and that includes me. I mean, there's times I've been quite antagonistic towards Islam and Christianity. I've been quite angry at them. And I've been angry at things in Judaism, like, circumcision and stuff like that. And the treatment of women in the Abrahamic religions is pretty appalling by any standards. All three of them. Not so much Presbyterianism, modern, but that's a lot. But that treated women the best of all the three of them. And maybe Orthodox Judaism as well. But there's a complexity of these religious dogmas that I would advise people to be very careful of when they come to say, "What are you?" I'm Catholic. Why? Because Ireland's a Catholic country. Why? Because St. Patrick converted us to Catholic. Was St. Patrick Irish? No, he was British. So how is he different from Cromwell? Because Ireland is. Think.